Most people are horrified at the end result of the anti-government rhetoric we saw in Washington, D.C. The younger generation embraces the sweeping changes needed to not only limit the worst effects of climate chaos, but also reduce the chances of the next disease we discover becoming a pandemic.
What does it mean then to continue to defend Saudi Arabian borders? At whose expense? Is it again going to be at the expense of Yemeni civilians?
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Maine to New York City and points west. Today, Palestine, Syria, climate issues, Yemen, and Russia. We start not with another Israeli killing, just an ecocide. 10,000 mature trees, including hundreds of olive trees, cut down or bulldozed by Israeli forces near Tubas in the Jordan Valley. What was their bureaucratic excuse? The Israeli military branch, responsible for civilian affairs in the West Bank, said it had carried out an enforcement activity to evacuate an illegal agricultural invasion in a fire zone. The enforcement activity was carried out in accordance with the procedures of the region's authorities according to the law applicable in Judea and Samaria. Get that? An illegal agricultural invasion. This from a government of colonial settlers. A Palestinian activist tweeted and wondered whether U.S. climate activists were interested in this destruction of thousands of trees. So at CT Climate tweeted to leaders like Bill McKibben and Robert Howarth and people in 350.org. Trees are the best way to keep carbon out of the air. The Israeli government fools are injuring the whole human race. Here's another meme that's found on Facebook. It's about Al-Rukban, part of Syria, that corner near Iraq and Jordan. It's within spitting distance of a U.S. base in Syria, but that base hasn't sent them any food in years. U.S. soldiers could literally drive to the Al-Rukban camp in a half hour. Tweet about this at Joe Biden and at POTUS. And if, like me, you were mystified about what POTUS means, its initials, President of the United States. Now some of the speakers at the Zoom webinar, Climate, COVID, and Capitalism. First up, Ben Martin from 350 Connecticut.
The most frustrating thing about activism is trying to get people to accept uncomfortable truths. We in the climate movement have been struggling against this for years. This has been starkly defined in the COVID-19 pandemic, when we have struggled to convince people that routine, everyday activities will put them and the people around them in danger of an unpredictable disease. We can imagine that when someone hears that they need to stay home, not travel, don't get coffee, and alter your life completely, that will cause fear, stress, and anxiety. And in that state, it is easy to believe that when a different source tells them that it's no big deal, nothing to worry about, or won't affect you, a good portion of people will latch onto those soothing lies so they don't have to face the fear and the difficult work of change. As I said, we in the climate movement are used to this reaction. When we state the scientific facts that emissions are rising, we can't go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that the whole system needs to change in less than a decade, it sounds like fantastical doomsday prediction. That can't possibly be true, is the reaction, because accepting this would mean risking losing whatever limited stability they have in their lives. Layer onto that the corporate media deception that the science isn't settled, and it's just nefarious actors trying to gain control of you, and it's no surprise that the anger of the populace is misdirected at each other rather than the real causes of the hardships. We have seen this all before, and it's not hard to spot the retread of these tactics to fight against implementing the proper safeguards to mitigate the suffering caused by COVID-19. Climate change was called a Chinese hoax. COVID-19 is being called the China virus. Shutting down fossil fuels would hurt the economy, is what our opponents will say. Shutting down public gatherings would hurt the economy, is what the people worried about COVID-19 restrictions would say. We can't let emissions restrictions take away our freedom. And then we hear we can't let the virus take away our freedom. The economic system encouraged these views because it distracts from the extraction of wealth from workers to corporations, like it distracts from the extraction of natural resources from our ecosystem. The more people fight against these scientific facts, the less we are able to fight the economic forces holding us back. The encouraging news is that more and more people are starting to see past the false talking points and recognize that there is more to gain in the abrasive facts than there is to lose. Most people are horrified at the end result of the anti-government rhetoric we saw in Washington, D.C. The younger generation embraces the sweeping changes needed to not only limit the worst effects of climate chaos, but also reduce the chances of the next disease we discover becoming a pandemic. A majority not only accepts the reality of the climate threats we are facing, but imagines and fights for a world without fossil fuels and an economy based on equality, sustainability, and human needs, instead of pursuing unsustainable growth and unending expansion. The job of our movement now is to recognize that the current systems cannot handle the kind of change we need, and any new system must be inclusive and address the causes that make people susceptible to corporate propaganda. So we just need our movement to embrace as many people as possible and embrace the needs of all the people so that we don't have people believing these ideas that are counter to their own interests. Thank you.
So next up, we have Gregg Gonsalves. He's an epidemiologist at Yale University. He also worked for 30 years on the HIV and AIDS and other global health issues with the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, along with some other organizations. So yeah, epidemiologist, very interesting. Take it away, Gregg.
Hi everybody. So I'm talking with a bunch of climate activists, but I want to talk to you because I think climate change and the pandemic are part of a larger public health crisis in the United States. And so I just want to talk to you a little bit about the history of how we got to where we are, and then talk about a new politics of care, which is, I think, the way we get out of both the pandemic in the short term and work towards getting out of global climate crisis in the long term. So we all know the enormity of the pandemic in the US. Over 400,000 people are now dead in the United States. Probably 500,000 will be dead by the end of February, beginning of March. We know what we're all doing to protect ourselves, right? Many of us are staying home, wearing masks, limiting our social contacts, but what are we doing to protect others, right? What are we doing to protect others really beyond the notion of charity that we're all pitching in, and that sort of our volunteer efforts are gonna make a difference in this pandemic beyond particularly last year when we got no help from the state, from the federal government to do what we needed to do to keep ourselves and our families safe. So it's not original insight a year in, but COVID is feeding on the structures of inequality in the United States. And we all have the temptation to blame Trump, even though he's gone for a little less than a week now. But we need to look further back in our past to look at the roots of our crisis. And so Janine Interlandi, in the 1619 issue of the New York Times Magazine 2 years ago now, talked about why the United States doesn't have universal health care. And she said, this has everything to do with race. And in the article, Janine talks about how in the midst of the smallpox epidemic after the Civil War, federal policy on health was filled with white ambivalence at every turn. The Southern former slaveholders didn't want workers to be too sick to work, but they didn't want them to be too healthy to be a full political force in the post-Civil War South. And these sort of theories of Black extinction, that free assistance of any kind would breed dependence, and that when it came to Black infirmity, hard labor was better than white medicine, something that persisted throughout the 19th and 20th century. Remember, there is no compulsory health insurance in the United States ever, right? As in the beginning of the 20th century, when many European nations started to take this on as a matter of course. African Americans were excluded from the New Deal. The Hill-Burton Act, which built rural hospitals in the around the U.S. In the Truman administration, was only able to pass the Senate because Southern senators were told that their white governors would be able to pick where in the South those new rural hospitals went. National healthcare has been called either the Prussian menace or the Red menace, depending on which era in the 20th century you're part of. And all we have to do is look at Medicaid expansion in the United States over the past few years and see where Medicaid expansion has been slow to come online or still been refused. And this is, again, in many of the southern states that were part of the old Confederacy. So we have a fractured patchwork of a healthcare system that has left millions alone against the virus. This makes us extremely vulnerable to what happened last year when the virus came washing over our shores. And conservatives have worked hard to bring this about, always implying that the safety net they were shredding was for somebody else, right? Somebody else who was darker, at a distance, less deserving. But what we know from this pandemic is that people cannot get early care, will get sicker. These delays in care, that means that more infectious people in our communities are further spreading the virus rather than being facilities that can care for them. And we also basically have wiped our hands of immigrants, prisoners, and people who use drugs. These are completely expendable people in the sort of logic of 2021, 2020 America. And there's been these arguments that we can't do enough, right? We can't break the bank. As we're talking about the new pandemic relief bill, Republicans have been saying, oh, we can't have a $2 trillion bill for pandemic relief, but there's no question about it when it came to having a several $1 trillion tax cut in the middle of the Trump administration. And this is also coming from people who were advising the Biden administration during the primaries. Ted Kaufman said, when we get into the White House, the cupboard will be bare. So that's about healthcare. When we think about public health, we only spend 3% of our healthcare dollar in the United States on public health, right? And so we've had a fractured healthcare system, but we've had a weak and crumbling public health infrastructure that set us up for our failures in 2020 and going into 2021. And finally, I came of age during the Reagan administration, and Ronald Reagan once said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And the state has been undermined as an important actor in our lives for 30 years, all of my adult life. And right now in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a climate crisis, state action is what we need to get us through to survive this new century, whether it's infectious disease or climate change. So what do we do now? My friend Amy Kopczynski at the law school at Yale and I have put some articles together in the Boston Review calling for a new politics of care. And it means that we really need to build a new deal for public health, right? We need to be able to protect our healthcare workers and our health systems. We need to have people to be able to stay home if they're sick, and that means paid sick leave, paid family leave. We also have to ensure that businesses and small businesses that might need to close have the economic support to do that as well. We already know that paid sick leave slows the spread of epidemics like influenza. Other kinds of social support, like food and rental assistance, are also essential. And this is the social safety net that Republicans and neoliberal Democrats love to hate. And it's what undergirds successful public health systems. And rebuilding will be the foundation of a new deal for public health. I'll stop there, but we can talk more about it in the question and answer.
It looks like some real progress is being made in stopping foreign intervention, that is, war, against Yemen. President Biden has suspended arms sales to Saudi Arabia and said the U.S. will no longer help out the Saudi prince in his war against Yemen. But the language President Biden used in announcing this could mean that he's giving himself an out. From Democracy Now!
In his first major address on foreign policy, President Biden pledged Thursday to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, which began 6 years ago and was supported by both Presidents Obama and Trump. Biden described the war as a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe.
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, We are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
President Biden's remarks come days after his administration announced it's freezing U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia and examining sales to the United Arab Emirates, including the sale of Lockheed Martin F-35 jets, which were approved by the Trump administration as part of UAE's normalization deal with Israel last year. The 6-year war in Yemen has devastated the country. At least 100,000 people have died. According to the UN, 80% of Yemen's 30 million people need some form of aid or protection. We go now to Lansing, Michigan, to speak to Shireen Al Adeimi, a Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University. Her new piece for In These Times is headlined, "Biden says he's ending the Yemen war, but it's too soon to celebrate." Professor Al Adeimi, welcome back to Democracy Now! That was President Biden's first day visiting the State Department. Can you talk about the significance of this move?
Well, this is the culmination of 6 years of activism and advocacy to end the U.S.'s role in the war in Yemen. As far as victories go, there have been far and few between, but this is probably the most significant victory, if you want to call it that we've had over 6 years, because we have a president who finally acknowledged the devastating war that is frankly caused by the U.S.'s participation, and is committing to end, at least in some form, the war on Yemen. So it's significant, it's important, but as we're going to talk, there are some details that we need to be clear about.
Well, why don't you talk about those details? What are you most concerned about right now?
So in his speech, Biden said that he's ending offensive operations in Yemen, but he went on to commit to defending Saudi borders. Now, this is really concerning to me because I still remember the statement that the White House put out when Obama initially entered the war in March of 2015. And that was the exact same framing, that they were defending Saudi territory from the Houthis. This is what led us here. 6 years of war, over 100,000 Yemenis killed, 250,000 people starved to death, if not more, the entire country destroyed. And the framing was always to protect Saudi borders.
Shireen, let's go to President Biden's exact words.
At the same time, Saudi Arabia faces missile attacks, UAV strikes, and other threats from Iranian-supplied forces in multiple countries. We're going to continue to support and help Saudi Arabia defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity and its people.
Professor Al Adeimi.
He says he wants to defend Saudi people. The Saudis have enjoyed U.S. support for decades, but certainly in the last several years, they have been the biggest customer of arms sales from the United States. If we look at civilian casualties, I can't find a figure of Saudi civilian casualties over 6 years. The missiles from the Houthis did not start until Saudi began bombing Yemen in 2015. And so to frame it as protecting Saudi borders or Saudi territories is very concerning, because if this is what we started off saying, and here's where we ended 6 years later, what does it mean then to continue to defend Saudi Arabian borders? At whose expense? Is it again going to be at the expense of Yemeni civilians? Is the U.S. going to stop supporting providing some supports to the Saudi-led coalition, but not others, for example, like intelligence sharing in the name of defending Saudi Arabia? Are they going to continue providing assistance to the Saudis, let's say with the blockade or with spare parts or with some weapon sales? He also used the word relevant weapon arms sales. So what does it mean to suspend relevant arms sales? Why not all arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE? So those are the concerns that I have. And I really want to be optimistic here, because this means so much to us after so many years of working really hard to end this war. But the details matter for the 30 million Yemenis who are living back home. Is this war going to end for them? We can't really see an end to this war unless the U.S. ends their support, all of it, training, spare parts, weapon sales, logistics, intelligence sharing, their support with the blockade. Until all of this ends, Yemenis are not going to be able to pick up the pieces and to, be able to live freely.
What about in one of his last acts in office, aside from inciting the insurrection, President Trump named Houthis as a terrorist organization?
So everybody seems to agree that this was a misuse of the term, misuse of the designation. The Houthis control areas of Yemen where over 70% of the population live. And so if they are designated as foreign terrorists, then, banks are not going to be able to operate in Yemen. So people like me living here who are sending money back home because 80% of Yemenis need aid to survive, we're not going to be able to do that anymore. All the aid organizations working in Yemen are not going to be able to reach the 80% of the population that needs aid to survive. And so that is just calling for an escalation of mass starvation and mass murder. The Biden administration has said that they are reviewing this policy, which is great news. They have until the end of February to make a decision, but really it needs to be reversed right away so that more Yemenis don't die because of this designation.
And what about still the UAE getting these F-35 fighter planes in exchange for the UAE recognizing Israel? But again, the Biden administration has put that on hold, is looking at that deal. What does the UAE have to do with Yemen?
The UAE is a major partner in the war in Yemen. They have been working alongside the Saudis since day one. They claim to have left Yemen, but really all that meant was that they no longer had UAE soldiers on the ground, but they instead trained mercenaries to continue operating in Yemen. The UAE is all but occupying the island of Socotra in South Yemen. They are supplying the rebel group, the separatist group in the south, the STC, and have been supporting them. They have, control over Yemen's gas plants and whatnot. So they have major ambitions. And of course, they run secret prisons in the south, and they've been involved in assassinations of religious leaders in the south. And so they have been extremely destructive. They are completely part of the coalition, and supplying them with F-35s is not going to do anything except to ensure that they are more capable to continue bombing Yemenis. They also have pilots and have committed planes to the Saudi-led coalition in their efforts to destroy Yemen. And so they're a major party of the war, and we shouldn't be supplying them with any weapons whatsoever, let alone these F-35s.
And finally, Professor Al Adeimi, the significance of President Biden ending the Muslim ban.
I mean, this is a victory, again, for many people. This should have never happened in the first place. Much like the war in Yemen, these things are easy to designate and so incredibly difficult to reverse. So I think that's a major victory, of course. I was expected that he was going to end that. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. And it has affected Yemenis. Yemen was one of the countries that was listed under that ban. And so Yemenis who are, bombed by the Saudi-led coalition with support from the U.S. were not able to leave the country because of the blockade. And those who were able to leave were not able to join family here or to come to the United States to seek a better life. And so I'm hopeful that this is how he started his administration. And I'm really hopeful that he will continue showing us that he's committed to ending the war in Yemen. And to fulfill his campaign promise to end all support for the U.S.-led military so that we can begin to talk about justice and accountability, because this isn't going to suffice.
Shireen Al Adeimi, I want to thank you for being with us. Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University. We'll link to your piece, and in these times, Biden says he's ending the Yemen war, but it's too soon to celebrate. As we end today's show, looking at another foreign policy issue facing the Biden administration.
I hope you did pay attention to those numbers. The numbers are ghastly. Deaths from bombing, from disease, from starvation. And do remember, this war started in the Obama-Biden administration. Now, Russia, where King Putin is actually facing a substantial opposition from a popular politician named Alexei Navalny, again from Democracy Now!
You mentioned Alexei Navalny, and we want to talk about the protests right now, the major protests in Russia. Moscow police have arrested at least 237 people today alone outside a court hearing for the opposition figure, Alexei Navalny. A Russian judge is deciding whether to send him to prison for 3.5 years, stemming from a previous conviction for which he was given a suspended sentence. Joshua Jaffa, you're the Moscow correspondent for The New Yorker. You've been covering all of this. I'm wondering if you can talk about the latest, who Navalny is, what it means that he's back, that he was poisoned. And just today, when they said you didn't report back enough to the court, he said, I was in a coma.
That's right. The latest is that at this very moment, Navalny is waiting a decision from a Moscow court, which will determine whether or not he'll be sent to prison for 3.5 years, based off of facts from a case that you just mentioned. Formally, the Russian authorities are charging him with violating the terms of his parole for not appearing regularly at a police station as required.
And Navalny was sentenced for not notifying Moscow while he was in a coma because of the poisoning. He got 2 years in prison. And from actor Alan Alda, how to save a life without doing surgery. Wear a nice, snug mask. And from Arnold Schwarzenegger, a tough guy who is not at all embarrassed to say he needs the vaccine.
Put that needle down.
All done.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, I just got my vaccine, and I would recommend it to anyone and everyone. Come with me if you want to live.
That last line was actually Arnold Schwarzenegger quoting himself in one of the Terminator movies. That's our program for today. Stay safe, folks, but stay active. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.